good to see you. So I hope you're doing well, and I am so excited to share this video with you because I made a miniature mushroom chess set. Yes, you heard me right. It is actually playable, and it is so tiny, and it is so cute, and it is so cottagecore. I mean, it just like check marks everything that is adorable. I feel like this is a perfect time to bring out this video, especially since, you know, Valentine's Day is coming up and I don't know what to get my hubby. So I figured why not make something handmade, something from the heart, and something filled with stress. Yes, it is actually kind of stressful to work on miniatures because they're so tiny, but it is definitely worth it because I feel like the end result is just everything and more. It's just like, mwah, chef's kiss. But yeah, I figured I'll just go ahead and show you the entire process of how I created this chess set, just in case if you want to make it for yourself or, you know, to give it to someone. So yeah, let's just go ahead and start the video. To start with, I will go over some of the supplies I will be using. I have a gridded cutting mat that's been cleaned, along with my silicone mold, some clay tools, and the clay itself, which is from the brand Sculpting. I begin by cutting small pieces of clay from out of the package. This clay is going to be used for the palm pieces. I then began kneading the clay to make it easier to work with. This mold is going to help me measure the clay out so the pieces can stay relatively the same size. So you don't have to use a mold, but for me it was easier. I did have to scrape some excess clay out, but it was still very easy. Now I just need to make 16 of these clay pieces. I brought out the actual palm pieces from my chess set just for reference, and then I got to work rolling up all of the 16 pieces of clay into small balls. For the pawn, I took inspiration from the super mushroom from Mario series. So to do that, I rolled one of the clay pieces into a chubby cylinder by rolling it back and forth, making sure that the bottom is flat. Then I slightly put pressure on the top of the piece to create a little peak. For the head of the mushroom, I took another clay piece and made sure it was rolled into a smooth ball, then I just gently attach it to the body by slightly pushing them together. Once the first set of pawns are done, I put them onto my little baking tray and baked them for 15 minutes at 275 degrees. Just to be safe, always read the baking instructions for your clay as it might vary. While the first set of pawns were baking, I worked on the second batch and baked those too. Now we can move on to the rest of the pieces, which means doing the same prep work, so grabbing some clay, pressing it into the mold, cutting the excess, then rolling the little pieces into balls. These are the Rooks, and for my version, I got inspiration from this picture that I got online. I started by rolling out one of the balls of clay into a cylinder shape until it was about ½ an inch, and making sure to pinch the top so it's a bit pointed. I then grabbed one of the wooden tools that has a sharp point and pinched one of the balls of clay before placing it on the tool. Then I just gently pressed the clay to create a cone shape. Now the head can be easily attached to the body of the mushroom. I then made 3 more mushrooms and set them aside before baking them all. Moving on to the knights, I decided to base them off this mushroom, and I created this by doing the same steps as the rooks. However, the only difference is that I added texture to all the heads using my wooden tool. For the texture, I created different sizes of holes on the head to try to mimic that mushroom as much as possible. I then used my finger to pat down any clay that got out of place. So far, these are my pieces that are baked and ready. But we still have a couple more pieces to make, like the bishops. And here is the inspiration. As per usual, I am keeping the body of the mushrooms in the shape of a cylinder and no bigger than ½ an inch. To create the head, all I did was take one of the balls of clay and pressed it down with my finger until it was flat. Once attached, this is what it looks like. Setting aside the bishops, we can make way for Her Majesty the Queen. For inspiration, I found this image of a phallus indusiatus, or also known as the Veiled Lady. So I did the same steps for the body, and for the head, I went back to the cone method using my wooden tool. When it came to attaching the body and the head together and adding the hole on the top, things just looked wrong, and it didn't look cute anymore. As much as I wanted to try to recreate the actual mushroom, it was hard trying to create the veil part, and I just couldn't figure it out. And to be honest, I wanted to cover the holes more than anything. So I tried different things such as making a crown, but I didn't like that, and I tried a big flower, but I didn't like that either. So I just decided to come back to it later. Let's focus on the kings. Of course, I had to use the king trumpet mushroom for inspiration. For the body of the mushroom, I decided to roll together 2 pieces of clay balls instead of 1. And instead of rolling it out into a cylinder, I shaped it more into a lumpy kind of cone. For the head, I placed a ball of clay on the tip of my finger and gently stretched it out using my fingers. I needed more volume on the top of the head, so I added a bit more clay on top and tried to smooth it out. I also decided to add some details under the cap of the mushroom using one of the tools to score some lines. After baking all the pieces, I went back to the queens and made a simple flower for the heads. I had to bake those separately and attach them using some hot glue. So now that the clay pieces are done, I focused on the board. To make the board, I decided to copy the design that my cutting mat already has, since it already has perfect little squares. Taking some tracing paper, I placed it on top of the mat and marked out how big the board should be. Once that was done, I took my pencil and layered on the graphite. I chose to use this small canvas for my board since it's already a perfect shape. Then taking the tracing paper, I put it over the canvas, making sure that the side with the graphite is touching the canvas. I forgot to mention that I traced the lines as well, so all the boxes would show. I then used some tape to secure the paper, and using a ruler and a sharp mechanical pencil, I traced over all the lines. If done correctly, there should be an outline on the canvas, and there it is. This is going to save so much time, and I don't have to measure anything, which is a win in my book. I felt like the board would be plain by itself, so I brought out the clay again and rolled some out. I made sure it was long enough to wrap around the entire board because I want to create moss all around it. I firmly pressed the clay along the board and made sure to smooth out the clay in the back so it was secured. I wanted to make sure that this clay wasn't going anywhere, so I used the tool to smooth out the clay even more. Once the back was secured, I went back to the front of the board, and this is where the fun part begins, adding the moss. For the effect, I use a sharp tool and lightly press into the clay and wiggle my tool around. It helps to go in circles and to not stay in one spot for too long. I then use my finger to pat down any excess clay that comes out. Once that was done, I made sure to bake the board to make sure none of that design gets ruined. Everything is ready to finally get painted, and I will be using some acrylic paint for that. I started with the easiest things to paint, which is the bodies of the mushroom ponds. For that, I chose white paint, and to help with the drying process, I stuffed some clay into the mold and pressed the mushroom into it so it wouldn't move while drying. Once it was dried, I started to work on the heads, which I painted using red. I did have to go over it twice, and for the details, I used the end of my brush and dipped it in white paint and added polka dots to the heads. For the other set of mushroom ponds, I added some brown paint to the red paint to make it darker. I also gave them the same polka dot details. Now that the ponds are complete, I worked on the other pieces, giving them a nice layer of white paint and setting them aside to dry. I decided to stay with warm, earthy colors for the rest of the pieces. For their darker counterparts, I used brown paint to darken the paints. For example, the Rook I painted yellow orangey color, then I used brown to make it darker. Moving on to the details, I used a toothpick to get into some of the nooks and crannies. Here's a comparison of a mushroom with some detail and a mushroom with no detail. It's very subtle, but I do like it. I had a hard time choosing what color to paint the board, so I decided to test out some swatches. In the end, I stuck with brown but added some red and yellow to make it a warmer brown. Once I was happy with the swatch, it was time to get to work painting the board. For the lighter boxes, I added white paint to the brown paint mixture and used that for the rest of the board. I did have to layer this 3 times and fix some of the lines with a smaller brush, but overall I was happy with the outcome. Time for the moss. I used this light shade of green and added some brown to it, that way it was more toned down and not so bright. I used this as my base paint and covered the entire moss in it. I then used a darker green and brushed it on random spots. I did the same thing with this yellow-green paint and brushed it on randomly. It's time to seal all this work. I used a glossy Mod Podge to seal all the heads of the mushroom pieces. For the bodies, I used a matte Mod Podge since I didn't want them to stand out and be so shiny. I decided to use the same matte Mod Podge for the moss, and since it was so textured, I didn't want any moss cracking off, so I had to press pretty hard to get all the goodness into the textured bits. For the board, I chose to go back to my glossy Mod Podge and seal that up with a big brush. There is one small detail I wanted to add, which is makeshift grips for the mushroom pieces. I used some hot glue on the bottom of the pieces and pressed it down onto the back of the mold. Now all the pieces will be easier to play with since they are more stable. Something else that bugged me is the back of the board. It looked way too messy, so in order to hide it all, I took some sticker paper and traced the board onto it. I then cut it and placed the sticker on top of all that mess. Now it looks much more neater and more finished. I also added some floor protectors to give the board some height. Speaking of protecting, I put all the mushroom pieces into these tiny Ziploc bags to make sure nothing would happen to them. All that work and this doesn't even fit. So yeah, I tried to make a box out of cardboard, but as you saw, it didn't work. So I decided to use 2 pieces of paper and glue them together to make it thicker. I followed a tutorial on how to make this box, which is super easy, and I will be sure to link it in the description because I do not want to explain it. My throat is going crazy and I've been talking for so long now. So I hope you can understand. Yes. I felt like this was missing something, so I wanted to add a love note into the box. So I used some tan paper, ripped it up, and used some fire on the edges. Yeah, so epic. I then wrote my heartfelt message for my one true love. Last but not least, the box needed some decoration. So I used these textured stickers to give it some little finishing touches. And after all that, it's time to play some chess. Can I kill you now?
No.
Why?
Because that's not how chess works.
What? How? Well, now what?
You have a king.
I have a king, what am I gonna do? What are you doing? Leave me alone.
You actually can't win.